Welcome everyone to Crash Course Apologetics, where I summarize the work of Christian scholars in animated videos and interviews. Today we're going to be looking at a video from Crash Course on what is God like. My guest is Dr. Ryan Mullins. And Dr. Mullins, will you tell us briefly a little bit of your background and maybe what makes you qualified to speak on this topic?
So I am an analytic theologian, and I work in Scotland. I got my PhD at the University of St. Andrews. I've held positions at Notre Dame and Cambridge, and I've published two different books on the nature of God, one on God and time, and another one on God, morality, and emotions. So that's why I'm qualified to speak on these issues today.
So the Crash Course guys that made this video run through a series of attributes that God has, and they try to show that there seems to be some kind of conflict here. And so we're going to play several clips. I would encourage you to go and watch the original video. I've linked it in the description. So let's go ahead and watch clip number 1.
I guess those kinds of questions would only apply to a heavily personalized and anthropomorphic God. But the traditional picture of God, the one accepted and even assumed throughout Judeo-Christian tradition up into modern times, is what we might call an Omni-God, possessing particular divine attributes, the characteristics believed to be held by God.
So those are the attributes that we want to talk about today, but there's a few more issues we need to get into here. So if you can go ahead and play the next clip.
Particularly in modern times, who point out that none of the traditional divine attributes are in the Bible anyway, so maybe God isn't an omni-God. Maybe he's more like a superhero. He can be way smarter than us, way more powerful than us, way more good than us, but still not perfect.
So there's several different things I want to point out about this video. The first thing is this: no serious scholar thinks that if you deny the traditional model of God, you're going to be making God into a superhero. I mean, I know there are some scholars who say this sort of thing, but I said no serious scholar makes this claim. In contemporary scholarship, there are lots of different models of God being debated within philosophy and theology. Every model of God affirms that God is a perfect being, and so what the debate is really over is what makes that being perfect. And so there's this thing called the method of perfect being theology. This is a philosophical method for discerning whatever the essential attributes of God are. And so it starts by defining God as the greatest possible being. And then from there, what you're trying to do is you're trying to figure out which attributes make something the greatest possible being. And so these attributes, they're called great-making properties. And so there's a bit of nuance here to try to figure out what these things are. So great-making properties, these are things that, all things being equal, it makes something better to have than not have. And so the idea here is, is you try to identify hey, this is a property, it might make you better. Well, but does it make you better full stop? Not just specific kind of makes you a little bit better than other people. It's got to make you better than any other possible being. And lots of philosophers, they agree on a particular set of great-making properties. It's things like maximal power, maximal knowledge, maximal goodness, freedom, rationality, and eternal existence. There's a lot more, but, that's the stuff at least we can discuss for today. Now, something that's pointed out in the video is they say that these attributes are not in the Bible. And so let's ask that question, though. Are these really in the Bible? Not exactly, because the Bible doesn't give us a detailed philosophical story about the divine nature. But there is certainly biblical justification for taking attributes like maximal power, knowledge, and goodness and saying those are attributes that God has. And there is certainly biblical warrant for thinking that God is eternal, because the Bible describes God as existing from everlasting to everlasting. But there's something that we should point out in the video, though. The video seems to be conflating two different understandings of God and time. And I think that only one of the conceptions of divine eternity has biblical support. But we'll get into that later.
Great. Well, let's go ahead and discuss the next clip.
In this view, God is omniscient, which means that he knows everything that can be known, and he's also omnipotent, or all-powerful. He's been said to be omnibenevolent, or possessing perfect goodness, and he's omnitemporal and omnipresent, meaning he exists at all places and all times at once.
So these are really standard attributes among most models of God. Jordan, can you give a screenshot again of those attributes?
Sure.
So we can have a list there. Okay, so I want to point out that this video is really sloppy at times. So notice here that it switches the definitions of omnipresence and omnitemporality. And this is just one of several points in the video where things get really sloppy. So for example, the discussion on the doctrine of analogy is so off base that we don't even have time to explain how wrong it is. I think people would just be better served by just sitting down and reading any introduction to Aquinas' thought. Now, with regards to the sloppy thinking about God and time, we're going to get into that later. For now, though, I will say that the video is conflating two different concepts here. They're taking something called divine timelessness and divine temporality, and they're treating them as if they're sort of the same thing. And then it's also building in a very controversial thesis about an understanding of time that no one before the 20th century affirmed. So there are lots of sloppy things happening here in this video. But, look, this is just a crash course video that they're making, so I really shouldn't be too hard on them. So let's just move on to omnipotence. So if we could go ahead and go to the next clip.
All right.
Can God create a rock so heavy he can't lift it? Is just one of an infinite number of unanswerable questions that can be asked about God. Like, if God is omnipotent, he has to be able to create something so heavy he can't lift it. Otherwise, his inability to create it would mean that there's at least one thing he couldn't do. But then he wouldn't be omnipotent, because if he were truly all-powerful, he'd be able to lift anything.
So there's several different things going on in this clip that we need to unpack. First, it's assuming a definition of omnipotence that hardly any philosopher or theologian would affirm. The definition is something like God can perform any action. But most people reject this because they think the definition does not account for logically impossible tasks, like creating square circles or married bachelors. I mean, those are just incoherent, so they cannot be possible actions. Most of the time, philosophers say that the paradox of the stone is also incoherent, and thus not a possible action. So the difference is in the analysis of why the stone is incoherent. So let's talk about this first, and we'll get a better understanding of a definition of omnipotence that philosophers actually affirm. So think about the stone. Why is this a paradox? I honestly don't understand where the paradox is supposed to be. I think that the so-called paradox of the stone is just a half-baked question. It's not a real objection. A real objection would identify a logically possible action and then say that God cannot perform this logically possible action. But I don't see why God cannot perform this action of the stone. So the video asks if God can create a stone so heavy that he cannot lift it. And I don't quite understand the issue here. I mean, heaviness, that's a relative term. So what's heavy for you might not be heavy for me. It depends on how much physical strength you have. So one way for God to create a stone so heavy that he cannot lift would be for God to become incarnate and take on a material body that's subject to different physical limitations. Then there'd be all sorts of stones that God could not lift while he's incarnate, in which case God can perform the task of creating a stone too heavy for him to lift. So there's no paradox here. And then he can just cease to be incarnate and then, snap his fingers and make the stone go away. No paradox, no problem. There's another way to get rid of the paradox, though. The heaviness of the stone, like I said, it's a relative term. So if you want to make the objection stronger, you could try to, make a better way to specify that the stone is unmovable. So you could say maybe it's not heaviness, but it's an unliftable or unmovable stone. And so here's what you can do. You can say God created a stone that fills every single spatial location. Then there are no other places to move the stone, because the stone quite literally is unmovable because it fills every single spatial location. So there's no other locations to move the stone into. So there you go. God can create an unmovable stone, and then he can annihilate it from its existence once he's performed that task. So again, no paradox. Now, all of this, of course, though, is assuming that omnipotence involves the ability to perform any logically possible action. But that's just not quite right. Most definitions of omnipotence, they have more nuance than this. So here's an example of a more sophisticated definition of omnipotence that philosophers actually affirm. So omnipotence is the most power-granting set of logically possible abilities. And so here's the nuance. Not everything that appears to be an ability is in fact a power, because omnipotence only includes abilities that are powers. Powers or abilities, they're like these really basic things, like the ability to perform intentional actions, like you intend to perform the action, or bring about certain states of affairs. But some things that appear to be abilities, they're actually liabilities. And liabilities are not powers because they are limitations or failures of power. Hence, liabilities are not power-granting, because liabilities do not make something more powerful. Liabilities make you weaker. So consider the ability to perform irrational actions. That's not a power. That's a liability. It's a weakness or a limitation. It's like I would be more powerful if I lacked the liability to perform irrational actions. If I had greater powers of rationality, I would be more powerful. And when we look at God and say that God is omnipotent, we are saying that God has all of the power and has no liabilities. So when you come back to the paradox of the stone, a lot of the so-called paradoxes that people offer are not actual powers, but are rather liabilities. In which case, these so-called paradoxes are not actually identifying any power-granting ability that God lacks. They're identifying liabilities or weaknesses that a perfect being is not subject to, in which case, they're not really saying anything about a proper concept of omnipotence. So let's go ahead and go to the next clip.
Now let's consider another question about God's personal skill set. Can God sin? If he's omnipotent, it would seem that he can, because he can do anything, but if he's omnibenevolent, or inherently good, then it would seem that he can't. This doctrine, which says that God can't sin, is known as divine impeccability. But if God is impeccable and incapable of sin, then doesn't that mean that he is not omnipotent? After all, I can sin, easily. I mean, give me 5 minutes, I could probably break like 2 or 3 commandments, like the ones about coveting stuff, not the murdery ones.
So our discussion of omnipotence is going to come out to play here, because a theist is going to say that the ability to perform sinful action is actually a liability and not a power. So sinful actions, they're like a failure to exercise certain cognitive powers like knowledge or rationality. But before we get into that, let's defining God's goodness in a better way. So according to Mark Murphy, God is maximally good if and only if God is appropriately responsive to morally relevant values. So in this way, a morally good agent is rational because it's rational to be responsive to moral values. So moral facts or values, they give one an objective reason to act a particular way. So T.J. Mawson, he says that a perfectly good person always does what he has most objective reason to do. So as omniscient, God will always know what he has most objective reason to do. As omnipotent, God's going to be free to perform that action that he has most objective reason to do. And then further, like a perfectly good God, his intentions are always good, and he never fails to satisfy his obligations. And then moreover, a perfectly good God's actions will give rise to the best possible consequences. So in performing these good actions, God will necessarily instantiate various virtuous character traits like generosity, wisdom, and what have you. Now, God's perfect goodness is always connected to his perfect rationality. So God is perfectly rational if and only if God always acts for the most objectively good reason. So according to Richard Swinburne, he says God is guided by rational considerations alone. So God's perfect rationality and his moral perfection, they're mutually entailing because moral considerations are reasons for acting. And so here's the result we get. God cannot perform a sinful action because a sinful action is a liability. You are liable to sin because you're liable to be ignorant, or you're liable to make a wrong value judgment, or you're liable to be less than virtuous character. An omnipotent God does not have any of these liabilities, and having these liabilities makes you less powerful, less rational, and less good. So there's nothing incoherent in saying that God cannot sin once you understand that sinning is not a power, but is instead a liability. So let's go ahead and go to the next clip.
Possible contradiction presents itself in the belief that the Omni-God is also a personal God. Many people find it difficult to suppose that God could be omnitemporal and omniscient, yet still have a personal relationship with his creatures. It's hard to understand how God could relate to us or feel the way we feel if he doesn't experience time as we do. If he already knows what's going to happen, how could he ever be surprised or change his mind? And if God is omnitemporal, is it even possible that he could be moved to respond to prayers?
So there are several things here that are very confusing about this discussion, which is understandable because all of the issues related to God and time are, they're super confusing. I think I can make them less confusing. So as I pointed out earlier, the video is actually conflating two completely different understandings of God's relationship to time and is building in some really controversial philosophy of time. So here's what the video says. The video seems to be saying that God is simultaneously located in the past, present, and future, but that just doesn't make any sense, and no major philosopher affirms this view. In fact, this really terrible misrepresentation of the issue has long been recognized as incoherent. So Anthony Kinney points out that if the past is simultaneous with God, and if the future is simultaneous with God, then the past and the future will be simultaneous with each other, in which case the distinctions between the past and the future have been destroyed. And that's really bad, so you ought not to do that. Thankfully, though, this has not been the actual view of anyone for most of church history. So this is something that I point out in my book, The End of the Timeless God. Here is what the actual majority view is. So the majority view says that God is timeless, and what this means is that God exists without beginning, without end, or without succession. In other words, God does not do one thing and then another. Sometimes theologians, they'll say that God exists in a timeless present that lacks a before and after, which just leads me to the next thing in the video that I think they're confused on. The video is sneaking in a controversial understanding of the nature of time. In philosophy of time, there's this debate over what moments of time exist. Now, the traditional view is that only the present moment of time exists. So the past no longer exists and the future does not yet exist. So the traditional view says that God cannot literally be present to the past or the future because the past and the future do not exist. And in fact, the traditional view even denies that God has any temporal location because God is timeless after all, and a timeless being cannot have temporal location. So what the video is doing is sneaking in a contemporary understanding of time, which says that all moments of time exist. All the past, all the present, all the future, all equally exist. But that's not all, though. The video is also sneaking in another contemporary view, which is that God is temporal, or God is in time. Now, God is temporal if God exists without beginning and without end, but he does have succession. In other words, God does one thing and then another. And so here is another problem with the video. Most people who affirm this view that God is temporal, they deny that all moments of time exist. Most philosophers who affirm that God is temporal believe that only the present moment of time exists. So you're not going to have God simultaneously located in the past or the present or in the future because the present is the only moment that exists. So once again, the video is being really sloppy here. I think this is a really serious problem for anybody who affirms that God is timeless. It's certainly true that a timeless God cannot respond to things that happen in time, because a timeless God, as the video points out, has to kind of build in his responses into his eternal plan. And so it's not really a response. It's just a pseudo response. And if you don't like that, then you should deny divine timelessness and adopt the view that God's in time. Now, if you say that God's temporal, you're going to say that God has a temporal experience. He experiences the succession of time just like you and I do. So there's a very real sense in which God responds to your prayer. God can't respond to your prayer until after you pray your prayer. Further, nothing about knowing the future prevents God from responding or feeling different emotions at different times. Since God is perfectly rational, he's going to have all the appropriate rational emotions at any given time. So when you sin, it's rational for God to be angry at you at that moment. And if you repent later on, it's going to be rational for God to be pleased with you at that later moment. And the video has not actually pinpointed a real problem here. If we had more time, I could create some potential problems and then address those. But this leads me to my final thought about the video. The good parts of this video are ultimately nothing but a series of interesting questions. They're not objections. And they're fairly standard questions that introductory textbooks and philosophy of religion address. So given how short this video is, it cannot possibly introduce you to all the various answers that theologians and philosophers take on these questions. And that's fine. But I urge people to dig deeper and explore the different answers that philosophers and theologians have to these different questions. And what you'll find is an interesting variety of rational, well thought out answers.
If you enjoyed this video, then you're in luck. This is just one in a playlist critiquing and diving deeper into the topics discussed in the crash course videos on the philosophy of religion. Hang tight and the next video in the playlist will pop up. While you're here, check this channel out. If you enjoy the content, then consider subscribing. Thanks for your support.